All right, good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Geneva Trade Week organised by the University of Eastern Finland and the International Institute for Sustainable Development, focused on tackling fossil fuel subsidies for a greener future. Is the WTO up to the task? I'm Alice Tipping. I work at the International Institute for Sustainable Development with a focus on fisheries subsidies, but a particular interest in this topic. Many of you, the experts in the audience, will be aware this is a particularly topical question in policy discussions. Despite fossil fuel subsidies' widely recognised responsibility for causing global climate change, many governments continue to massively support the use of these fuels, both their production and their consumption. Fossil fuel subsidies have recently been estimated to amount to almost $500 billion in 2019. And recent research has shown that in the context of recovery plans from COVID-19, twice as much money is being spent on activities that produce or are heavy users of fossil fuels rather than on clean energy. And this is just based on what we know is out there, because detailed information on fossil fuel subsidies exists for, we think, less than 1/3 of the world's countries, which makes discussing their reform particularly hard. And this situation is, we think, all the more concerning when you consider that on top of their well-known environmental impacts, fossil fuel subsidies also have far-reaching social, economic, and trade consequences. They can constitute a considerable burden on scarce public funds. They significantly distort competition in the market for renewable energy, and they play, we think, a particularly problematic role in hobbling the transition, the much-needed transition to a clean energy future, and even to recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So, thinking about it from the Geneva perspective, where I'm sitting, the WTO has a lot of experience in negotiating, establishing multilateral rules on subsidies, so it would appear to be the logical forum for the forum of choice for tackling fossil fuel subsidies. But we haven't yet had any WTO disputes on the issue. The WTO also has a notoriously low record of compliance with subsidy notifications, so it's an open question exactly how useful and in what ways the WTO can be a useful forum for fostering transparency and effectively constraining government support to fossil fuels. So this is our question today. Is the WTO really up to this timely and essential task? To help answer this question, or at least give us different perspectives on it, we have a panel of experts who are really kind of the who's who on fossil fuel subsidy reform. But before I introduce them, I wanted to give you, the audience, the chance to give us a very quick temperature check on what you think. So here's our first poll question, and be aware you have 1.5 minutes to respond, so please be quick. Do you think international trade rules and the WTO have a role to play in encouraging the phase-out of fossil fuel subsidies? 1, not at all. 5, definitely. So quick responses to that, please, and we'll feed that into the presentations. So presentations by whom? I'm delighted to be joined this morning by 5 experts. Harro van Asselt is a professor of climate change law and policy at the University of Eastern Finland's Law School and a senior research fellow with the Stockholm Environment Institute. He has 15 years of research experience and is an expert on the interaction between international climate change governance and other fields of international governance. Ronald Steenblik is a senior fellow at IISD and until recently was special counsellor for fossil fuel subsidy reform at the OECD's Trade and Agricultural Directorate. He's led the OECD's fossil fuel subsidies reform effort, guiding staff working on it, and has also served as chair of the G20's voluntary peer reviews of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Joy Ari Kim, we're happy to have you as well. She's a senior economic affairs officer at the United Nations Environment Programme and a technical advisor of UNEP on the green economy under the Partnership for Action for the Green Economy. She's also leading a green fiscal policy project in the economy division of the UN Environment Programme. And we also have on the line Sarah Mayman, who is manager of the Trade Negotiations Division in New Zealand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and also chief negotiator for the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, that's the ACCTS. Sarah, we're conscious it's very late at night in New Zealand, so a special thanks for joining us this late. We have just a few minutes left on the poll. And I might then turn, so a few seconds left, in fact, left on the poll, and I might perhaps turn, Harro, to you first. You'll see the poll results coming up in just a second, and I think we also have some slides for you. Harro, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Alice, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. So in the next 15 minutes, what I will do is try to do three things. First, start explaining why we should care about fossil fuel subsidies and their impacts. Then I will argue that existing WTO rules have limited potential to address fossil fuel subsidies. And then lastly, I will point to some avenues for tackling fossil fuel subsidies through the trade system and give several recommendations for the way forward. So why do fossil fuel subsidies matter? According to OECD and IEA data, subsidies to coal, oil and gas production and consumption amounted to 478 billion in 2019. In comparison, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, renewable energy subsidies in 2017 were about 166 billion, even though these subsidies cannot be fully compared. The support for fossil fuels matters from the perspective of climate change mitigation. First of all, because it artificially enhances the competitiveness of fossil fuels. Fossil fuel subsidies also divert investment from renewables and lock in carbon-intensive energy systems for decades into the future. And fossil fuel subsidy reform also matters from a broader sustainable development perspective. Subsidies mean that public funds are being diverted from other development priorities, such as public health and education, particularly important in these times. Moreover, fossil fuel subsidies tend to be regressive, ultimately mainly benefiting the richer segments of society. And then lastly, fossil fuel subsidies, and also importantly, of course, in the context of today's discussion, can have distorting impacts on international trade, which means they should be of interest from the perspective of trade rules. So speaking of those trade impacts, so what are the different types of trade impacts? Here we can distinguish direct and indirect trade effects. Direct trade effects mean that the subsidy strengthens the competitiveness of the subsidized producer directly. And indirect trade effects refer to pass-through effects that give downstream producers that use the subsidized inputs a competitive edge. So the possible trade effects of fossil fuel subsidies can be very diverse, just like with any other subsidy. They may include the reduction of a competitor's world market share, the displacement of imports, as well as the reduced competitiveness of alternatives such as renewable energy. And these trade impacts can affect upstream fossil fuel products, as well as downstream non-energy products, and also the products that use fossil fuels or fossil fuel generated electricity. Moreover, and again, that's something that Alice already highlighted in her introduction, fossil fuel subsidies can affect the trade in renewable energy products, such as solar panels or wind turbines. This is a particular challenge in light of what is currently needed in terms of the scale of the energy transition. So I'll have a quick peek at the poll, and I am not fully surprised with the response, even though, of course, there's still a limited number of participants. But if you look at the poll, you see that 10 out of 17 participants indicated that the WTO should play a very strong role in addressing fossil fuel subsidies. And that's what I'll be talking about next. Because if the WTO is to play a role in fossil fuel subsidies, then I would say a first question is to what extent can existing rules play such a role? Like other subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies are in principle covered by the WTO Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, or the ASCM. But can this agreement, as it stands, effectively constrain fossil fuel subsidies? To assess this, we need to follow the basic steps of the ASCM, which I've depicted in the current slide. So that means that first, a measure needs to be a subsidy, so be defined as a subsidy, which means that it needs to be either a financial contribution by a government or any public body, or any form of income or price support that ultimately confers a benefit. Demonstrating this can be fairly straightforward for some types of fossil fuel subsidies, but in other cases it might be slightly more difficult, for instance when establishing whether preferential tax treatment for fossil fuel producers amounts to government revenue foregone. But assuming there is a subsidy, then the next question is whether it could be a prohibited export subsidy or a local content subsidy. And here in the research that we've done and in a report that will soon come out, we've looked at these categories in a little bit more detail. And we've argued that some fossil fuel production subsidies may be prohibited export subsidies if it can be shown, at least among others, that the recipient is export-oriented and that domestic markets are becoming saturated. But even if a subsidy is not prohibited, it may still be actionable, which is one of the other main categories of the ASCM. So for it to be actionable, it would first need to be shown that the subsidy is specific to certain enterprises or industries or specific regions. Now, for consumption subsidies that benefit a wide range of energy consumers, meeting this requirement will be quite challenging. In comparison, if we talk about fossil fuel production subsidies, they are more likely to be deemed specific, because they may be targeted at specific producers. Then actionable subsidies, if we want to actually challenge them, they ultimately also need to lead to adverse trade effects. And proving that some of these effects are materializing or threatening to do so can actually be quite hard. And in some cases, it will require a claimant to show that the fossil fuel subsidy itself leads to actual trade effects. This can be particularly hard to do when we look back or think back at the categories that I listed. For example, the category of pass-through effects, but also the category of effects on renewable energy products. It can be quite challenging sometimes to actually prove that some of these effects are being caused by fossil fuel subsidies themselves. So overall, the finding that we have is that challenging fossil fuel subsidies under the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures is hard. And along with political reasons, because this is, of course, not just about the law and about the evidence that needs to be gathered, but also about political and strategic reasons that countries may follow to either challenge or not challenge a fossil fuel subsidy. But these legal barriers at least help to explain the absence of challenges to fossil fuel subsidies under the WTO that Alice already referred to. But in addition, I would say that one of the main limitations of the ASCM is that it focuses solely on the trade distorting effects of subsidies. It does not take into account the social and environmental externalities of fossil fuel subsidies, including the effects on climate change, even though increasingly it's being acknowledged that they are very good reasons to try and tackle fossil fuel subsidies. So what are the possible ways forward? So having outlined some of the limitations of the existing rules, I would say it's important to stress that the challenge is not impossible. Specifically, for some fossil fuel production subsidies, it may be possible to demonstrate that a subsidy amounts to either a prohibited export subsidy or an actionable subsidy with adverse effects. One possible way forward is therefore that a WTO member challenges another member subsidy. While for actionable subsidies, this requires the presence or the threat of adverse effects affecting the claimant, no such requirement exists for prohibited subsidies, meaning that any country in principle could challenge such a subsidy. However, if members are not willing to challenge each other's subsidies, which they may well do for all kinds of political reasons, they can still try to pursue reform within the WTO. And here I would distinguish two broad options. First, and we'll talk about that more during this session, is that members could try and improve transparency of fossil fuel subsidies, for instance, by improving the notification records, which Alice already mentioned is dismal, or by using the trade policy review mechanism. And as I'm quite sure that my fellow panelist, Ron Steenbeek, will talk about, such options need to be seen in the context of broader efforts to strengthen transparency of fossil fuel subsidies. And these broader efforts include current reporting under the SDGs, as well as a number of countries undergoing voluntary peer reviews in the context, for example, of the G20 or APEC. The second broad option is the WTO members could negotiate new rules under the WTO, either through an amendment of the ASCM or through negotiating a standalone agreement on fossil fuel subsidies, which would allow them at least to start somewhat on a blank slate. Such negotiations could aim to create new subsidy prohibitions with a greater focus on the environmentally harmful impacts of fossil fuel subsidies. To create such rules, it will be important to develop ways of distinguishing between different types of fossil fuel subsidies, particularly with regard to their effects on climate change, as well as air pollution. New disciplines could, for example, specify possible exceptions to the rule as well. And here we can think about specific groups of countries, or even specific types of subsidies, such as subsidies that may be aimed at providing energy access to low-income communities. Clearly, we're not naive in terms of suggesting the feasibility of these rules. Negotiating new rules will be technically challenging, it will be politically challenging. Although the successful adoption of new disciplines on fishery subsidies could help set the stage for negotiations of fossil fuel subsidies, it's also important to realize that the example of fishery subsidies shows as an example that it can take a very, very long time before any agreement is adopted, when we know that these discussions already started in the 1990s. Given the ongoing challenges in the WTO that we've heard a lot about this week, members could also negotiate plurilateral or regional trade agreements to address fossil fuel subsidies. And one important forum in this regard is the recently launched negotiations for an agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability that Alice already mentioned, and I'm sure that other panelists will talk about more as well. Here we have a number of countries that aim to develop rules based on the effects of fossil fuel subsidies on climate change, which is exactly what I was calling for earlier. So these negotiations could ultimately offer important lessons on how to design rules on fossil fuel subsidies that could work for the green economy and that ultimately also encourage multilateral efforts. Then my final slide. So I just wanted to summarize my main recommendations. And I think probably a recurrent thread in this panel is that improving transparency will be key. And transparency can be pursued both inside and outside the WTO. making use inside the WTO of notifications and trade policy reviews, and outside through reporting under the SDGs, undergoing voluntary peer reviews, as well as efforts by other international institutions. And second, as I mentioned, although any legal challenges will face significant hurdles, I do think that members could explore in more detail that if there are any fossil fuel subsidies by other members that may warrant a talent challenge. Clearly, whether these subsidies will be challenged as such is a different question, but a challenge as such may be very interesting to figure out the real potential of the ASEM rules as they stand. And then third, it's important to realize that creating multilateral disciplines on fossil fuel subsidies will take time. Therefore, it's important to move the idea forward as soon as possible and start discussing the options, as we're doing today as well. So efforts such as the ACCTS negotiations, as well as the fossil fuel subsidy reform ministerial statement in the previous ministerial conference of the WTO, I think they should draw wider participation, at the very least from those countries and regions that have committed to phase down fossil fuel subsidies, that have stated leadership aspirations in the area of climate change, and that have also expressed their willingness to green trade agreements. In addition, it will be important to invite major subsidizing members to join the discussion to better understand reservations and concerns that some of these members may have with regard to the impact of any new disciplines on their economies. And I think the next ministerial conference offers a key opportunity for members to launch such an informal dialogue to launch this discussion. Then finally, as a researcher, I also just want to reflect on some areas of research that I think will be necessary in the near future. First, I think it will be important to examine specific fossil fuel subsidies to shed light on their trade effects, as well as their legality under the ASEM. And moreover, I think a key issue for those interested in developing new rules on fossil fuel subsidies will be to figure out how we can distinguish subsidies on the basis of their effects on climate change. Maybe we'll hear more about that in the remainder of this panel as well. And with this, I would like to hand it back over to Alice. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Hera. I mean, that was, I think, a really useful sort of explanation of particularly kind of the trade effects of fossil fuel subsidies, which I think is something that we haven't looked at a lot in the policy community already. And there's just one question, just to come back to make sure I've understood. I mean, as you were going through the options, there was the option of challenging fossil fuel subsidies under the prohibited subsidy rules in the ASEM, which I think was your conclusion was that might be relatively, or might be easier. And then the other option was to challenge fossil fuel subsidies under what's called sort of the adverse effects or sort of the actionability rules in the ASEM, which requires, of course, that you demonstrate that the fossil fuel subsidy has actually had a trade impact, that your industry has suffered some kind of injury or result, and that might be harder. But just to dig into one point, which I think helps to set up the rest of the presentations. As I understand it, the reason that proving adverse effects of a fossil fuel subsidy might be harder isn't actually a legal one. It's not that a fossil fuel subsidy wouldn't legally meet the test. It's that we have so little information about fossil fuel subsidies that it's just difficult to gather the evidence you would need to prove that the adverse effects have happened. So it's an evidence problem rather than a conceptual legal problem. Is that right? Have I understood it correctly?
It's in part an evidence problem. Now, any subsidy experts on the call would probably say, well, wait a minute, that's also a problem for many of the other subsidies that we face and that are being challenged. So it doesn't mean that the evidence problem is insurmountable. But I think it might be challenging in the sense that we know that information about fossil fuel subsidies is generally limited. And it will be quite resource and time intensive to dig up all that information. The ASEM does have a mechanism where the complaining country under actionable subsidies can request information from the country providing the subsidy in some cases. So this could help in some cases. But generally, we know that the information base for fossil fuel subsidies, particularly when it comes to the notification information, is quite dismal. So that clearly doesn't help anyone trying to build a case.
Okay, super. No, that's helpful. And I thought that might be kind of a useful reminder for us as we move into the next couple of presentations, which focus very much on how, what information we have about fossil fuel subsidies, and where might we be able to gather more information essentially to make better policy decisions at a national level, but also in the WTO. So I might turn next perhaps to Ron, because Ron, what we thought we'd be really grateful for some views from you on exactly what is the nature and extent of the information we have on fossil fuel subsidies. Are there gaps that need to be filled? What are the implications for negotiating disciplines at the WTO? Ron?
Yes, hi.
And just a quick reminder, we've been asked by the translators to speak a bit slowly, so I will endeavour to do that.
Okay, I'll try to behave as well. Good morning and thank you. Yeah, topic very close to my heart. Yeah, well, first of all, I've put up a poll, or the organizers put up a poll. To whom would you primarily look to for information of fossil fuel subsidies on individual countries? This is just a big a question to judge awareness of what information is out there. And again, what people have about 1 minute, 18 seconds left, I think, something like that. I mean, to start off, let me explain why I wanted to talk in detail about the data. First of all, and I think Harrow has done a very good job in setting out the issue of information. But there's been a lot written, basically calling by international legal scholars, calling on the WTO to play a greater role on fossil fuel subsidies, and always as part of that is talk about transparency. It's almost like, well, you know, the proverbial let's assume a can opener. It's like, okay, we just need countries to notify better. I mean, I 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would have said, yeah, that's really important. We've seen the record, and it is pretty poor. I've written an article for this for the upcoming IISD trade quarterly, their first quarterly, which will be coming out, I think, mid-October. And in thinking about that, I realized, well, wait a minute, isn't calling for greater transparency, particularly through notifications, really putting the cart before the horse in the context of actual negotiations to develop disciplines. Disciplines is the trade language term for restraints on subsidies. And if you look back at past and present negotiations on developing disciplines for subsidies, they've never started on the basis of notifications. They've always started with information that has existed elsewhere. And so far, the main source for that information was actually the OECD. The OECD in the mid-1980s had developed a fairly substantial database on government support to agriculture, and that led ultimately to a similar approach being taken in the WTO with their aggregate measure of support. In the current negotiations on fish subsidies, which were kicked off in the Doha round, which was at the end of 2001, the OECD had just recently published detailed information on fish subsidies for its member countries. Over time, of course, once the framework, the architecture of these agreements had been worked out, then certain transparency requirements were imposed on the members of the WTO, particularly the more developed members, and we started to get some reporting. But even in the case of agriculture, that reporting has often been incomplete. It's been several years behind, and that's led to, for example, either countries or in some cases independent organizations like IFPRI developing counter notifications or shadow notifications. The other interesting thing is that you know, we got this more formal process and better notifications to the WTO, but that didn't put an end to the OECD reporting on agricultural support or on fishery support. And in fact, those have deepened and expanded to more countries. It's so they and these are intergovernmental organizations. The intergovernmental organizations have decided that, well, we need these data too, as a check and as a more timely and more consistently applied way to get that information. So let's look at the case of fossil fuel subsidies. I'm not quite as pessimistic as I was hearing from Harrow about the paucity of information on fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, if you look at the OECD database, which was just recently expanded by 6 more countries, there's 50 countries, probably accounting for the majority of fossil fuel production and consumption in the world in that database. And when you combine it with the IEA information, you have a lot of information out there. Now, I encourage anybody who's not looked at that database to look at it and see that it's detailed policy by policy, not just at the federal level, but at the subnational level. So states in the United States and in Australia, provinces in Canada. Yes, it could be improved. Yes, there could be more information brought in. And that's something, a big role for non-governmental organizations to do, who've also played a role in actually contributing to the database. But I think it's the best one has out there. Now, the big gap in information, I would say, at least in that database, is government-mediated credit. So the loans and loan guarantees, perhaps investment by state-owned enterprises. Measuring, and the reason that's not in there is that because they do play a big role, but for a database like that, you to be consistent, you need to have information on the subsidy equivalent value of that. And so for a loan guarantee, that could be, like, say, equal to 1% of the loan that's been guaranteed, or it could be even as high as 8% or even higher. And it takes a lot of number crunching to estimate that. And you need access to information on the conditions of the loans that's often just not publicly available. So that's also a big role that can be played by NGOs. Now, I don't think it's necessarily crippling, because one could imagine in a negotiation that you might have an agreement to basically end all credit-related support. And that's easier than, for example, immediately phasing out consumer price support, because basically all it affects is future possibilities. You're not creating losers through the elimination of some kind of capital-related support. And then the other information you might want is still there on regular grants and price support and tax expenditures. So anyway, my point in all this is let's not tie ourselves too much to the problem of insufficient information coming into the WTO. There's lots of other places to look for those data. That has always been the case, in fact, in negotiations. But second, and to really tee up what Joy is going to say, is that the OECD database, again, it doesn't cover all countries, but fortunately, the UN, in its Sustainable Development Goals process, decided to create an indicator on fossil fuel subsidies, and that's supposed to cover the whole world. And so that's now where the UN is going to play an important role. And in fact, hopefully, all these different sources of information, the OECD, the IEA, NGO information, can be brought into that, as well as new information provided by countries. So I'll end it there, and I think that's a place now for Joy to take over. Oh, one thing, could I just discuss the results of the polls? I'm very happy to see that actually, I believe that is D the OECD, or is D, I forget what the, okay, you know.
Yes, I think
that,
D was the OECD, the IEA, or both.
Okay, thank you very much.
Super. So you're pleased to see there were many, many votes for the OECD.
Yep.
As a collector of information, good. And that probably reflects, I think, exactly the point you were making, right? That the OECD and the IEA already have a good database of exactly what these fossil fuel subsidies are. So perhaps the, kind of the base of information is there, and it's a question of how to use it most effectively in either enforcing or designing new WTO rules. You made one interesting point. I'm not going to kind of come back to it now, but just to sort of put you perhaps and Harrow on notice. You made this really interesting point about already, firstly about not letting kind of the imperfection of information cripple the idea of negotiating new rules. And I think that's an important one. Coming sort of from the fisheries subsidies perspective, we are never going to have perfect information in any international policy context. And if the problem is clear enough, there's a policy imperative to resolve it, right, as far as best we can. And that's just a reality of any policy decision. You won't have perfect information about it. But you made this really interesting point about the focus on perhaps looking first at disciplining some kinds of subsidies, right? This idea of credit support rather than focusing immediately on consumer subsidies, for instance. So that's a sort of a discussion that I think I'd like to come back to if we have some time at the end, right? Looking at this sort of the universe of different kinds of fossil fuel subsidies, are there some that would be more amenable to a prohibition, thinking about it in the WTO context, or more amenable to exceptions? So I might come back to you on that question at the end. But next, Joy, we'd be really pleased to hear from you precisely about the point Ron was making about the indicator for SDG 12.C.1, which of course is the target that focuses very much on eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. So Joy, can you give us a sense of how measurement and work under that indicator is progressing?
Thank you, Alice, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I think that I should probably manage the presentation. Okay, there you go. I have a couple of slides just to introduce to you, as mentioned by Ron, about improving the transparency of understanding better fossil fuel subsidies in the context of the SDGs. Clearly, we know that there were actually existing process of measuring fossil fuel subsidies before the SDG, but in addition to that, the SDG process is really to contribute further to understanding better of the transparency of fossil fuel subsidies by binding and motivating all the UN member countries to look at these issues, given the significant implications that these fossil fuel subsidies have. And I think that in particular, in the context of the COVID situation, as we actually see in many countries with the very, fiscal status constrained, addressing and tackling of fossil fuel subsidies becomes more and more, priority for many countries who actually have to struggle to finance the, containing the crisis, both the health and economic front. As you may all know very well, there is a specific target under SDG, rationalizing fossil fuel subsidies. And very fortunately, compared to any other indicators that may not necessarily be very quantifiable, the SDG 12C1 has a specific indicator to measure the amount of fossil fuel subsidies per unit of GDP, both from the production and then consumption side. And I would like to briefly mention about this tier classification for different SDGs, and particularly on this specific one, because initially when the SDG was agreed by the head of states, this fossil fuel subsidy indicator was classified as a tier 3, which actually means that they didn't recognize that there was internationally established methodology to measure fossil fuel subsidies. And I think that it became clear when we start looking at these fossil fuel subsidies to develop methodology to guide the countries to measure and then report the fossil fuel subsidies, despite that there were a number of processes, as I mentioned, by different agencies, OECD and IMF, to measure fossil fuel subsidies. There is a lot of disparity across this database, if you like, because of slightly different methodology and the coverage of countries and etc. So all the figures that we see between 500 billions to 5 trillions, the scale of fossil fuel subsidies, the confusion came from this underlying different approach and understanding and methodology, if you like. So the UNEP as a custodian has developed this methodology together with the OECD and then Green Global Subsidy Initiative, which was approved by the interagency expert on SDG indicators. So now it actually is classified as a tier 2. And once our database under the UN SDG system have more than 50 countries of database, it would actually be upgraded as a tier 1. So just to go into a little bit of details, I'm not going to go too much technical details, but just to share with the audience about what sort of data we would actually collect in the process of SDGs, from countries. So basically, there will be 3 categories of subsidies that we would actually collect. Direct transfer of funds, induced transfers basically refers to price support, and tax expenditures, other revenue foregone, and this is basically what Ron is talking about, is the credit support. So these are going to be collected in a template that we are developing right now, which is going to be accessible to all UN countries. Just a small note that the last category of these tax expenditures and other revenue foregone, and etc., we understand that there is a bit of challenges and complexity in terms of collecting this data, given that there is challenges in terms of international comparability, and there's a lack of practices on reporting and collecting this category of data. So we actually, provide a little bit of flexibility to countries to make it optional, but we still encourage countries to collect this data, and then we provide the support for countries to understand better about these categories and then collect the data under this. In addition to that, because there was also a question to me, basically what sort of data we will actually collect, through this process. As I said, we are developing a template, but we would also, in addition to this quantifiable data, would actually ask the countries to share with us about some of the, information, additional information that can actually help us better understand about the fossil fuel sector, and then information in the country, such as past or ongoing reform that took place in the country, and some of the qualitative information that can contextualize better about the figures that we receive from the countries, so that we can actually have a better understanding about, in general, what is actually going on in different countries. This just very briefly to help you understand about the process. But as I mentioned that, maybe let me go to the next one. So in terms of the process, I mean, through the SDG process, the reporting should start this year, 2020, and then the reporting would actually go on until 2030. But we are still very much in the preparatory process this year, because we actually have looked at some pilot country cases, countries like Zambia, for instance, or countries like India, and how different they are in terms of the available data and the way that they actually have been looking at the collecting these fossil fuel subsidies. And we noticed that there is quite yet a wide range of disparity across these countries. So in the preparatory process, we still needed to support these countries in terms of building their capacity to start collecting data on fossil fuel subsidies, or understanding better about what we mean by saying fossil fuel subsidies, because not all these countries do actually share the same definition even of fossil fuel subsidies. So the methodology that we actually have developed covers all this basic information, but we are planning to provide a support through technical training workshops at the regional level. And we are also developing a training materials. This would actually go into a deep dive of all these technical details to support the national focal points of SDGs in UN member countries over a couple of days. And hopefully that it would actually, help countries and national focal points to understand better and then start collecting this bottom-up, nationally collected data. The reporting is going to through a web-based platform, basically a one-stop platform where all the SDG 12 indicator national focal points would come and have access to template and report through, which is called SDG 12 Hub. This is going to be launched the beginning of next year. There has been a slight delay due to the COVID situation. But basically, this is a platform where all the national focal points, at least for the SDG 12, would actually come and then report. Now, one thing that I would actually mention that as far as the UN SDG reporting process is concerned, the national focal points for this specific indicator and fossil fuel subsidies is the National Statistical Department. Now, I think that for many countries, they still need to identify further specifically who is going to be the focal point for this SDG 12C1. But I think that it's most likely to be the same national focal point. As opposed to, I understand that in other processes like G20 and then OECD, the national focal point has been the Minister of Finance. So I think now it's at the country level, they need to also look at this issue and then consolidate and sort of the streamline about national focal points to make sure that this information is being shared between the different maybe national focal points, or actually just make a national focal point to deal with the fossil fuel subsidies, I would say, because it's officially the national focal point for SDG 12 C1 is a National Statistical Department. And I think that it's also very important because we actually engage with the statistical committee when we are developing a methodology, and they're very keen to make sure that collecting fossil fuel subsidies at the national level is going to be very much in line with the statistical system that they actually have. Another thing that I would actually mention is, as I said, maybe for the first few years of the reporting period, that we also expect, given the different capacity across countries, that maybe the database that we would actually have may not be totally populated, and we may actually resort to a globally available database. But this is going to phase out, and this UN the statistics managed database is going to be largely populated with the nationally collected database, because that's the whole purpose of SDG reporting, that we actually want countries to start looking at their own data, collecting their own data, and then report upstream to the UN statistical department that is going to manage the whole SDG global database. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much indeed, Joy. And I think that gives us a really useful perspective on, I guess, kind of on the almost sort of the transition from the internationally available information we have in the OECD and the IEA and kind of the IMF estimates, and a real focus on bringing the conversation down to national government levels, right? And I mean, it sounds like it's it must be sort of a fascinating and but also challenging job, right, to encourage government statistical agencies in particular to try and see how their data can be fitted into the very clear, very simple structure for the indicator measurement that we've developed. And I know that from an IISD perspective, the input that we had on helping to shape that indicator is one of the things we're most proud of. So it's really encouraging to see the effort that's going into making it live essentially in the context of national government statistics and national government policies. And perhaps kind of moving from kind of we started with the law, I guess, kind of what, how is it that the ASEM currently tackles fossil fuel subsidies? We've looked at the data with Ron and with Joy, and I wanted now perhaps to move to the sort of the politics and the policy of it with Sarah, if you're there, Sarah. And thank you for being so patient. Again, I'm conscious it's really late where you are. But, New Zealand's been one of the countries that's, in fact, sort of probably the country that's pushed most visibly and most vocally for proper attention in the trade system and in the UN general policy system for attention on fossil fuel subsidies. So it's fantastic to have you as a representative of that government here. Can you give us perhaps a sense of, from your perspective, what are the main current efforts that are underway in the policy sort of context, particularly the international policy context, to advance the issue of fossil fuel subsidy reform? And I can already see a few questions coming into the chat and the Q&A. If you have questions for the panelists, please do make sure you've recorded them. There's a couple there that I'll bring in. But perhaps, Sarah, if you're there, I'd be really interested to hear your perspective on what the key areas of work are currently.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you very much for having me on this panel. Yes, New Zealand's strong view is that trade policy has a vital role to play in supporting efforts to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. We've heard today about the damaging and trade distortive nature of these subsidies. The preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement is explicit in placing sustainable development at the heart of the WTO's raison d'etre. And we have long-standing architecture that's familiar to all of us, demonstrating that the international trading system is capable of effectively addressing subsidy spending when the political will to do so exists. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives we've championed to galvanize trade policy action. I'll highlight some of the political commitments that have already been made but haven't yet been followed up with real reform, pointing to the role that trade policy can play in assisting to bridge that divide. I'll discuss some of the key initiatives that we've been a part of to raise the profile of this issue in multilateral and regional trade forums, and some of the political challenges that those efforts have faced. And finally, I want to discuss the plurilateral initiative called the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability that's been mentioned, that New Zealand has launched alongside a group of 5 other like-minded countries who are ready to act on designing specific fossil fuel subsidy rules now. So the other panelists have articulated very clearly the why, that the fossil fuel subsidies distort trade and investment, are contrary to global commitments to reducing carbon emissions, and they're highly regressive. Despite this widespread recognition of the policy rationale for dismantling this vast set of harmful subsidies, reform has been slow. And it's not for lack of attention or acknowledgement. The G20 and the 21 APEC economies have committed to action on fossil fuel subsidies as far back as 2009. And since then, they and others, such as the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, the V20, the Pacific Island Forum leaders, the G7, they've all issued statements calling for the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. This is again supported, as Joy noted, by the Sustainable Development Goals, where all UN members endorse the need for subsidy reform. And the UN Secretary General has continuously highlighted fossil fuel subsidy reform as a priority issue for addressing climate change, including at last year's climate summit in New York. So it's clear that without addressing the use of fossil fuels, we won't be able to reach the goals set out in the Paris Agreement. And it's against that backdrop that the question then becomes, how do we bridge that divide between rhetoric and action? And how do we hold countries accountable to the commitment to phase down? And New Zealand is very much of the view that trade policy has a role to play here. And with that in mind, we have been a part of a number of initiatives that seek to bring this topic to the fore in multilateral and regional trade forums. In 2017, New Zealand and 11 other WTO members delivered a statement at MC11 which sought to initiate a dialogue at the WTO on fossil fuel subsidies and the role purpose-built trade policy measures could play in addressing them. And just as trade and production distorting subsidies are addressed by the WTO in the Agreement on Agriculture and the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, which were discussed earlier in today's panel, and currently under negotiation in the fisheries subsidies negotiation context, we contend that the international trade system would also be able to address fossil fuel subsidies. We just need a mandate to design rules that are fit for purpose, that speak to the gaps in the current legal frameworks. We think the WTO has the transparency and the notification mechanisms already in place. They're proven and tested. The rules framework and the breadth of 164 members for effective and real impact. Putting to one side the technical challenges, which are significant, and I'll come back to that a little later. On the political front, one of the barriers that we face is this sense that the WTO is not the right forum for addressing this issue, that it's best left with the UN or in development conversations. That's an argument, frankly, we struggle to understand. As was comprehensively demonstrated by earlier speakers, this is also a trade issue. And why wouldn't we address the distortions that these types of subsidies are creating through similar prohibitions that we already recognize we need in the case of agriculture subsidies, industrial subsidies, and environmentally harmful fisheries subsidies? The establishment of rules on this type of harmful subsidy spending establishes a framework to finally hold us to account. Treaty commitments on elimination would show what could be done when countries understand the sense of crisis and urgency and demand to see tangible progress. So we will be following up the 2017 MC11 statement with a renewed ministerial statement to present at the 12th Ministerial Conference in 2021. And we hope we'll be joined by more countries in calling for a dialogue in the WTO on this issue. The statement will encourage information sharing and experience sharing, and it will clearly signal that sense of momentum that countries recognize there is a trade dimension to this and a trade policy lever that we should be using. We're supported in these efforts by the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, which is a grouping composed of non-G20 countries, including New Zealand, who continue to keep the issue on the WTO agenda by hosting webinar events and releasing research on trade and climate policy intersections and global government spending and reform efforts, working in close partnership with IISD on that. And the Friends of Advancing Sustainable Trade, who are championing FFSR and other mutually supportive trade and climate initiatives. The FAST group are currently working on a proposal for the establishment of an informal working group to complement the work in the CTE and provide space for like-minded countries to come together to explore practical ideas and recommendations for actions. This work in the WTO and these groupings follow in the footsteps of efforts in APEC and OECD, where countries are voluntarily submitting themselves to peer reviews of their fossil fuel subsidy programs. These peer reviews are an incredibly important tool for improving transparency, as Ron discussed, and sharing information, experiences, and best practice on reform. This brings us to the plurilateral initiative that we have got underway. Now, multilateralism is always going to be New Zealand's overarching goal for meaningful change and impact. but it's slow going, and the pace of progress doesn't match the urgency of the crisis. So in parallel with our work in the WTO with our partners, we've also been pursuing a plurilateral initiative, ACTS. ACTS was launched last year in 2019 and at the margins of Climate Week in New York in the UN. And we were joined by Fiji, Norway, Iceland, Costa Rica, and Switzerland in launching this negotiation to try and address, amongst other things, fossil fuel subsidies. The aim of ACTS is to bring together some of the interconnected elements of the trade and climate agenda. So this also includes liberalization of environmental goods and new and binding commitments on environmental services, designing voluntary eco-labeling guidelines, but most significantly, the jewel in the crown of the ACTS initiative, if you like, is the development of legally enforceable disciplines to eliminate harmful fossil fuel subsidies. Now, we are under no illusions that this is going to be an easy task for us. It's certainly a very complex issue, and a number of the other panelists have spoken to that. This grouping, our little grouping of 6, will try and tackle questions related to scope, to definition, to primary commitments. What would they look like? What should they look like? Questions around transparency, exclusions, the issue of development. It's certainly a very rich and dynamic question that's before us. But as others have mentioned, and you yourself, Alice, noted earlier, the kind of complexity of the challenge and some of the missing gaps in our knowledge on the data side is not enough, we think, to stop progressing this important work. Essentially, what ACTS calls on is for us to envisage what modern trade rules equipped to support the climate change challenge could look like. Our vision is an enforceable trade agreement of treaty status, one that's transparent, supportive of multilateral rules, open to all who can meet the required standard, and demonstrates in a substantive manner how trade measures can support and drive climate and environmental objectives. Our hope is that these kinds of initiatives, beginning first with a small group of countries and then with an expanding membership, will create the momentum to eventually lead to multilateral solutions, which is always our overarching goal. Thank you.
No, super, Sarah. That was an extremely useful sort of perspective, I think, on the real policy questions, right, and kind of in how these questions can actually be advanced in practical ways. And I think, sort of thinking back always to the interaction, I suppose, between regional and plurilateral initiatives and the multilateral ones. I mean, the P4, of course, kind of began as a relatively small regional trade agreement in the sort of Western Pacific and gradually grew to become the CPTPP, right? We saw, again, thinking from the fishery subsidies perspective, we saw 2 specific rules on fishery subsidies begin in the context of the CPTPP negotiations and serve as inspiration for the multilateral rules that are now under negotiation in the WTO. So, I think it's no surprise to anyone in the trade policy community how valuable these pathfinder sort of small, quick, kind of rapid reaction agreements can be in actually demonstrating what is possible and what it might look like. My sense is once policymakers see what is possible, suddenly kind of many of the myths of it is impossible begin to fall away. We have a good amount of time, believe it or not, for questions and answers and a bit of discussion. So thank you very much to the speakers for being so concise and so clear. There were a couple of questions from the audience that I wanted to bring in at this point. And the first perhaps kind of goes back to this question of the indicator 12C1 and the work that's being done to support national level authorities in identifying and understanding and collecting and recording the information they may already have on fossil fuel subsidies. And the question that's sort of come up in the chat is, thinking about kind of the current policy context, right? I mean, all policymakers are stretched. They're dealing with a kind of a traumatic pandemic that's focusing a lot of policy attention there. And it's a question perhaps kind of for Joy and for Ron, but it would be interesting, Sarah, if you have any perspectives as well. But perhaps to start with Joy and maybe Ron. I mean, do you have a sense, I think this is the focus of the question, do you have a sense that the pandemic is making it more difficult to attract policy focus on this question of fossil fuel subsidies and the sort of the recording and the understanding of the information, or is it sort of something that is managing to still get traction amongst the policymakers you're speaking to? Joy, would you like to perhaps kind of give us your perspective on that, and then Ron or Sarah, if you have anything to add?
Thank you very much for this question, which is very relevant in a broader context of actually fiscal policy, because we look at the fossil fuel subsidies as a part of, the broader fiscal policy issues. I mean, as we are working with the many developing countries in particular, we know what they're struggling with right now. So, I mean, they are preoccupied with the emergency measures. Clearly, and gradually, people are also putting together these recovery packages. So, it may concern that, okay, this, how it's going to actually disturb a number of different, efforts that is being channeled. I think that in that regard, it may not necessarily only this, efforts to measure fossil fuel subsidies. In general, there's a lot of disruptive elements in the country. But I think what is important is to look at it in the broader context, as I mentioned, that, in general, the countries, their biggest concern right now is a fiscal constraint, because they really have to contain the health crisis. And in addition, they really have to contain the economic crisis. And, in that context, even if there is a lot of internationally available money that maybe flow, actually there is going to be very difficult for many developing countries to borrow this, finances. So ultimately, they also need to look into their domestic situations and resources and what they can do about it. Put aside these discussions about the debt swat and etc. And we have been talking to many countries about smart managing of these fiscal situations to better cope with the COVID situation. And then the first step that you need to look at it is whether there's any space to cut down inefficient government expenditures. And then that's the fossil fuel subsidies goes in right there. As Ron mentioned, that of course there is the issue of political economy, if you are going to cut down the consumption side, the subsidy, but there is actually room to cut down and then look at what are the sort of these revenues foregone and the credit support to be removed, which is going to open up quite a bit of fiscal space for countries when they really have to redirect these resources for the health front and any other social safety net strengthening aspect of government expenditures. So I think that in the medium term, I would say, and then that's what we also have been advocating and talking to countries, is that to cut down these inefficient government expenditures that is also environmentally harmful, and that's the first step for countries to do a green recovery.
No, super. I think that's a really useful perspective, and I think that probably answers, I hope, one of the other questions that we had in the Q&A about kind of whether there was a risk that countries might sort of decide to focus on other SDGs rather than this one. But I think the point that you're making about looking at this as a holistic question of overall fiscal expenditure, right? Kind of overall, what does your budget look like? And are there, if you have a particular crisis to face, what are your ways of meeting that challenge, right? If international funding is going to be perhaps more difficult than you'd hope to access, what are your internal sources of funding? And aren't fossil fuel subsidies a good option for beginning to bring more resources to deal with the crisis? Unless we had either Ron or Harrow wanting to jump in on that, or perhaps Sarah. I don't see any nods. Okay. There's a question, perhaps an interesting one for Sarah, if you're still there. A very good question. What made New Zealand prioritise fossil fuel subsidy reform, particularly in the context of the ACCTS? And the person notes in particular, currently, other than the EU-Singapore FTA and the ACCTS, trade agreements don't appear to address fossil fuel subsidies. In the language in EU-Singapore, this person points out as hortatory rather than binding. So, I mean, from the perspective of somebody who negotiates FTAs all the time, how do we incentivize or encourage countries to bring an issue like fossil fuel subsidies into free trade agreements, regional trade agreements? What is it that would make it more interesting for governments to consider in the context of a smaller negotiation, do you think?
It's an excellent question, and it's one that we've been grappling with for many years as we've tried to advocate for action on this, but haven't necessarily found many buddies. The truth is that not in political terms by any sense, but in kind of from a policy coherence perspective, this feels like a very important gap in the current architecture. And so we really believe in the cause, if you like. And that's on a trade policy basis, on a climate basis, on fiscal responsibility grounds. It's really, especially when it comes against the backdrop of talking about the need for action on pricing carbon, and then to have $500 billion, $500 US billion of subsidy spending taking place. The incoherence of that is hard to fathom. So we do see a role for trade policy here. We know that trade policy rules are effective in disciplining and putting parameters around subsidy spending. So it feels like a very natural solution to us. Without wanting to downplay the complexities of the issue, this feels like a lever that we should be discussing and thinking about how to use properly.
Super. I mean, there's another sort of a follow-up question, if you don't mind, that's in the chat. And perhaps this is kind of linked to this, and it might be a question for you and perhaps also for Harrow, but is there an argument for setting up fossil fuel subsidy commitments against some kind of trade-off? I mean, is there a need for technology transfer to encourage countries to essentially sort of to be more attracted to what is, one would think, already a rational decision for themselves to reform fossil fuel subsidies? But are there ways of, do you think, building some incentives into agreements to make it more attractive, or do you think the fiscal coherence and the policy coherence argument should stand on its own?
Well, it's a live question for us now as we think about how to design the rules for acts. There's no denying that it's with 75% or so of that 500 billion on the consumption side of subsidy spending, there is a huge development dimension to this issue, and we'll be wanting to think carefully about how. And trade policy people aren't the right people to be advising on how to undertake the reforms themselves. So how do we kind of work hand in hand through all of those various dimensions? I think there are things that there are trade policy actions that we can take that will also support fossil fuel subsidy phase down. A major one, an obvious one, is action on environmental goods and removing tariffs on those goods and services and barriers on services. I mean, again, it seems that those two would be very complementary to one another, and those actions, if we could step forward together on that, would be a good step.
Super. No, I think that's a really useful response, and perhaps kind of leading leading on from that, there was a really good question which I wanted to come back to too, and I warned Harrow and Ron that I might at the very beginning. So I'm pleased somebody else has put it in the chat. If there were a potential agreement, and sort of thinking ACCTS aside, but just as a thought experiment, in a potential agreement, and this is, I guess, kind of asking you as fossil fuel subsidies experts, if there were an agreement wherever, in the WTO, somewhere else, that disciplined fossil fuel subsidies, are there categories of subsidies, kinds of subsidies, that would deserve to be prioritised for disciplines and for reform? And I'm reminded that in the plenary session that we organised for the sustainability stream of the Geneva Trade Week, we had John Merton, who is the UK's COP26 envoy. And at the very end of that session, we asked all of the speakers, if you had two to-dos for trade policy to address your particular area, what would they be? And he said, eliminate subsidies to coal-fired power plants. And it's extremely clear. And that gave me kind of an interesting sense of where at least kind of a perspective on what some of the most harmful kinds of subsidies were. So as an example, there's that idea out there, but I'd be really interested to hear perhaps from you both and also from Joy. And Sarah, you've done a lot already, but if you had any additional ideas, if we're thinking about what kinds of subsidies deserve particular attention in a trade agreement, what would you pick? Harrow or Ron, as you wish, go first, or Joy.
I'm happy to go. It's because I raised it as a question at the end of my presentation as well. So better to at least share my own preliminary thoughts on that. So I think the first question, if we're talking about environmentally harmful effects, I think the first question is, can we trace back environmentally harmful effects to individual subsidies? And I think this is actually quite challenging. And in theory, it would be the best way, I guess. But I think it's also hugely difficult to actually manage that. So I think talking about categories of fossil fuel subsidies makes sense. Now, the first category that would come into my mind, in a similar way that Ron was talking about not creating new losers, is to focus not just on coal-fired power plants, but on any new fossil fuel infrastructure. Whether it's a new coal mine or new coal-fired power plant, a new oil and new well focusing on drilling in the Arctic, anything that countries have not started doing yet, but may do in the future or may support in the future, would be, I think, a very clear target to start with. Also, because that's the best way to avoid new carbon lock-in. So for me, that would be the clearest no-brainer. Then I guess the next choice is whether you want to focus by fuel. And I'm not surprised that Mr. Merton mentioned coal-fired power plants, because the UK is, of course, part of the Powering Past Coal coalition, which aims to phase out coal-fired power plants. So maybe a more political strategic perspective would be to focus on those sources or on those fossil fuel subsidies that focus on things that are already becoming not done. So coal-fired power plant is one here. We could also look at what increasingly multilateral development banks stop financing. So look at the tar sands, look at coal mining in general, look at oil and gas drilling in the Arctic. These are all activities that are increasingly becoming seen as non-profitable in the long run, but also as really, really bad for the environment. So that will be a much more political, strategic approach to the question. And then finally, and it's also responding in part to a question raised in the chat. Maybe, given that we are talking about a trade agreement or an agreement that links trade and other considerations, maybe we should look at those subsidies that have both trade effects and also environmental effects. So maybe focusing on those subsidies where we know, for example, that they would likely fall under the prohibited export subsidies under the ASCM already, but we also know that they might have significant environmental effects. So basically using two criteria to base that on. But ultimately, I think a lot of these categories will be political choices. They can be informed by research, but I think a lot of them will be political choices.
Super. I think that's really interesting. Perhaps I'll ask Ron what you think, and then come to Joy and then Sarah on the same question. What should we be focusing on? Ron?
Okay, yeah. Generally, I agree with Harrow, and I mean, the reason I mentioned uh, capital-related subsidies was mainly because of this issue of you can end them pretty quickly, and not that necessarily in negotiations like the acts that they should do it sequentially. I'm just saying is that in terms of any kind of phase out, you would hopefully have and end these kinds earlier, and then other ones you might talk about phasing out. Now, this is an important point because I've been in workshops where people who are really mainly concerned about the pricing of fossil fuels, and I mean, there's even, a guide in the IISD which really puts stress on, oh, these should be phased out. That should never be the case if you're talking about capital related supports. Because what happens if you say, oh, we're going to phase out these loans or these loan guarantees or capital grants, whatever, 2 years from now, what are you going to get? You're going to get a surge of applications for this. You're going to make the situation worse by announcing you're going to phase it out, because you can see this in examples in all kinds of subsidies across the world. That kind of thing should be done overnight. Any kind of announcement is like, as of last night, midnight, we have phased these out. No more applications; they're accepted. So that's one thing. A slight, and then on the questions of the other ones that are price distorting, and it's what most of the models, the large computable general equilibrium models have looked at is price related subsidies, and so we've seen the results of some of those models show significant trade shifting effects. For example, for energy efficient industries, there was an OECD analysis done in 2011 looking based on the IEA price subsidies. It showed that a reduction in some petrochemical production, for example, shifting from the Middle East to Europe. So, I mean, definitely agree that there could be more of that type of analysis, but there certainly has been that kind. And for that, I mean, I think that's where organizations like the World Bank and the IMF can play a big role in, and perhaps UNEP also in working with countries and showing the alternatives like conditional cash transfers and stuff to just overall general pricing policies. But there's countries differ in terms of the capacity to be able to do that. I just want to pick up on one thing that that Sarah made about she's concerned about negativity about the WTO. I mean, I'm certainly not negative about the WTO. I'm very much a supporter of the WTO, but I mean, I'm just afraid of people putting all their eggs in that basket. And one thing that can help, and I think this is one thing. I mean, I was a co-author on the SDG document on the methodology there, and one of the reasons that I saw that as so important is that there's strong centrifugal forces over the question of subsidies to the definition of what gets covered by subsidies when one's talking about fossil fuels, and so you have the IMF measures. One part of what it measures is basically similar to what the IEA does. They just cover more countries, and that's all well and good. But they also have this other thing, which they call fossil fuel subsidies, which is basically an estimation of externalities. And then you have now ongoing work, which is basically seeming to call even support for laid off workers in the airline industry as fossil fuel support. I think this is dangerous. And why is it dangerous? Because when and I've seen this in meetings with WTO delegates, that they come to these meetings and they say, okay, yeah, this sounds good, but what do people mean? And we have this number and we have that number, and you know, it becomes an excuse for not dealing with the problem. And it also scares them, because if they think that, oh, when we sit down and we start negotiating this, we're going to have to be talking about subsidies to airlines as part of this, that's the best way to scare these guys away from sitting down and talking about it. Let's start with the clear stuff that is related directly to fossil fuel production and consumption. And that should affect also the rhetoric and the way we talk about this. I feel very strongly about this, as you can tell.
No, that's super, Ron, and I think it's a really important point for those of us who are kind of interested in advancing this discussion, is to keep it very focused. And this is one of the things that I think, in particular, the paper that Harrow and my colleagues Tristan Hirschlinger have been working on, that focuses very much on. And also working with our other colleague Tom Morenhood, focusing very much on the trade impact of these subsidies and looking very specifically at what kinds of subsidies we're talking about. Because as you say, kind of keeping it clear is, I think, the best way to make the case for something to be done, and it keeps it clear to policymakers what exactly we're talking about. I want to make sure we give Joy and perhaps Sarah, if you'd like to, the chance to weigh in on this particular question as well. If there were particular kinds of fossil fuel subsidies that deserved most attention, what would they be? Joy, and then we may need to wrap up relatively quickly. Joy?
Okay, I would just speak briefly about that. I was actually hoping that I would answer the next question that I do see in the question and answer about climate change, but I guess maybe next time. I mean, in terms of the what to focus on, I would just share some of the thinking that we actually had when we were working on this, the framing the fossil fuel subsidy, what to be reported and provide a guidance to countries. I mean, we actually needed to think about the practicality and feasibility behind it, rather than raising our level of ambitions too high in the process of SDGs. And as I mentioned, that we actually have done a pilot, country studies, across countries, like different, totally different countries in the totally different continent, to understand better about where they stand, because we really have to start from where countries are right now, and then propose something that is, applicable and then practical. Because at the end of the day, what we actually want is for countries to start really, looking at it, motivated to collect this data and then understand better about, where they're actually spending their money for what and how. So, I mean, I understand that, I would actually say that the level of data that we would actually collect may not be as, granular as OECD or others. But what we actually want is, we are providing this structure of the 3 sub-level of subsidies, with the third categories even optionals, because we understand about the challenges. We actually want countries to go, move forward progressively, to starting with the first 2 categories, make sure that, solid nationally collected data being collected for these 2 categories. And the third categories, I think that it would actually take time for countries to understand, and maybe there are some sort of, standard that should be agreed among countries if possible. But encouraging countries to look at this, tax expenditure as well, because this can be also quite, sizable. And of course, it actually should come with some sort of support and further technical discussions and, knowledge building. But we have already kind of, provided, I would say, guidance in terms of where the country should focus on and start off, and then make sure that, some solid data to be collected, and then, progressively they actually move on as we go on, maybe raising the level of ambitions later on.
Super. Well, perhaps while I have you, while you have the floor, let's focus on this other question, the one that had come up in the Q&A, which talks about the fact that climate considerations have gained increasing importance amongst the population in a number of countries. But then, of course, we have COVID affecting economies and people's lives in hugely unexpected ways, and government priorities shifting towards addressing this pandemic. And so perhaps a question for you, and then I might give Sarah the last word. Do you think the time is still right to take strong action on fossil fuel subsidies?
Yeah, I mean, to that, I think that my answer remains the same. I think that I have already answered that. And then the reasoning also was given, but I think that, in relation to climate change, the answer, I think that it's even more convincing. I don't think that we are talking about COVID crisis versus climate change. This is not a trade-off, and this is not something that we can actually do a trade-off. We are talking about like $13 trillion of recovery packages being put together, and this is going to really shape our future. Where they're going to put this money, and it's going to have a huge climate impact. I mean, we are not talking about only overcoming a COVID crisis. We don't know what we are going to face, and clearly we actually have a bigger crisis, which is called the climate change, which is we foresee that it's coming. So in tackling COVID situation, which actually requires a recovery, and then we are talking about green recover better and stronger and more resilient and sustainable. And the fossil fuel is actually at the heart of it as a recovery packages, but also to deal with the climate change, because without addressing fossil fuel subsidies, I mean, we can only go far when it comes to climate change. So all these things are interlinked. I just have to emphasize that we should not be myopic, talking only about the COVID, because this is all related. If we actually want to avoid another, the zoonotic related crisis like a COVID, we really have to focus on the green recovery. Climate change and fossil fuel subsidies are all part of that. Without addressing these, we will not actually advance, very much, at least the humankind, in the future, avoiding all these different kind of crises.
Super. Sarah, I might give you the last word as our kind of government representative person who's at the coalface of policy making. Is the time still right to take strong action on fossil fuel subsidies?
Well, I can be very, very brief, Alice, and just say that I would echo everything that Joy said. I would very much share that perspective. We're actually having this discussion at a critical point of inflection, I think, for countries who are determined. The choices that are being made now will be the repercussions for decades to come. So no better time to be discussing this. So very much a strong, resounding yes from me on that.
Super, thank you. So as expected, but also still good to hear. I mean, I've really enjoyed the session. I hope you all have too. We started kind of with a focus on the latest research we have on the trade impacts of fossil fuel subsidies, their environmental impacts, the extent to which they can be tackled already in the WTO and where some gaps might be. We've talked about the information we have to help to tackle some of those challenges, again, where there are gaps, and how best we can go about building them into both international and particularly national data gathering exercises. And then we had an interesting discussion about exactly what we should focus on towards the end, and the question of COVID. Is the time still right to focus on some of these fossil fuel subsidies? And I think the response I got from all of my panelists at least was yes. Thank you very much to all of you who've joined us. Thank you for the questions and answers, which made my job as a moderator much more easy and very interesting. Thank you very much to the panelists, particularly Sarah. I have no idea what time it is where you are, but I suspect it's very late. Thank you for staying up with us. Thank you very much to those who've spoken, and a particular thanks to my colleague Christian Erschlinger, who put this session together, and to the organisers, the producers behind the scenes. You haven't seen them, but to Simran, to Dmitry Grozobinski, and to Juanita Kalibala for making all of this happen. I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and thank you very much again. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
See you.